So with the most recent sandbox tuning pass in Destiny 2, some of our primary weapon types got a pretty decent damage buff. While auto rifles were the big winner, having their PvE damage improved by 25% versus red bars and majors, pulse rifles, sidearms, and hand cannons all got a 20% bump, which is still quite respectable. And when I hear PvE hand cannon buff, there are a few specific weapons that my brain immediately flags. And while I do plan on covering the other ones in upcoming videos, I made Malfeasance my first priority. It's a useful little gun with some nice utility and surprisingly good damage output for what it is. And while it probably didn't need 20% more damage, I'll gladly take it. Malfeasance is an exotic kinetic hand cannon firing at 180 rounds per minute with 20 rounds in the magazine, and it is backed up by some pretty solid stats. While the range and the reload speed are average for the most part, the stability, the airborne effectiveness, and the recoil direction are very good. The drawbacks are the handling at 24, which is quite low, and the aim assist at 50 is on the weaker side compared to other hand cannons. Then the explosive shadow intrinsic trait has had an update since I last covered this weapon. Malfeasance fires tainted slugs that burrow into combatants. If an enemy is hit by 5 shots, those slugs will then explode. And yes, these do compound if teammates happen to be running Malfeasance as well. The perk that was tacked on a few seasons ago, these exploding slugs will now stun unstoppable champions. The exotic perk Taken Predator grants Malfeasance bonus damage to Taken enemies and Gambit invaders. If you've yet to get your hands on this weapon, the acquisition source should be a long-form quest tied to Gambit and the Drifter. I don't think anything has changed with that, but if you know something I don't, feel free to drop it down in the comments. But with that, let's get into some damage numbers. And real quick, I have decided to part ways with damage testing versus Carl. He's never been the ideal target for any serious damage testing because his damage taken is reflective of a major. He's not a true boss, which in the past I was able to circumvent by testing versus the Hydra boss on Europa and compare the numbers. But since Lightfall, I noticed that the overworld damage scaling between Nessus and Europa is also showing a discrepancy, which is no bueno for accurate number representation. So I'm going to try pivoting to the Spire of the Watcher dungeon, particularly the Akalos encounter. We'll be seeing numbers with baseline dungeon level damage scaling, which should be better lined up with activities where focusing on your damage output is more impactful, and I'll be able to give you accurate figures on red bar, major, and boss tier enemies. The process does require a little bit more legwork on my part, and the environment isn't nearly as friendly as testing in the Conflux Lost sector, but hopefully I can provide you with better and more relatable data. So cheers to Carl. He served me well over the years, but with any luck, we are off to greener pastures. But back to the matter at hand. Starting out with boss damage. Crits are landing for 3,660, and we're seeing 2,440 on body shots. After we land 5 shots, each one of those slugs does detonate for 3,568 points of damage, just slightly less than the value of a crit. So if we were to land each shot in the 20 round magazine as a crit, we deal 73,200 points of damage, plus another 71,360 from the slug detonations. That puts the maximum single mag damage at 144,550. The time to fire off a full magazine I have clocked in at 6.56 seconds, resulting in a single mag damage per second of 22,036. Not exactly melting bosses, but it is a primary weapon. And when I see primary DPS up over 20k versus a boss, I consider that to be pretty darn respectable. And if Akalos just happened to be a Taken enemy, we'd actually be seeing 25% more damage. And I'm sure as many of you know, this also works versus an enemy blighted by Witherhorde. Now in an actual activity, you'd have a teammate running Witherhorde, but when just swapping over, you can see that our crit damage moves up to 4,575, with the explosive shadow slugs detonating for 4,460, a flat 25% in both cases. So, versus a theoretical Taken, that's 180,700 for single mag damage, and 27,546 for the single mag DPS. If you're targeting a major enemy, like one of these Minotaur, once the shield is stripped, crits will deal 4,730 and 3,153 on body shots. Our slug detonations are registering 4,611. This is 30% more damage than we were getting versus our boss tier target. And if I am remembering correctly, because I didn't physically collect the data ahead of time, my apologies, I believe the damage discrepancy between boss and major was 10% for hand cannons. If that is the case, then that does line up perfectly with the 20% damage increase that we saw in the last tuning pass. But this is allowing you to make pretty quick work of these Minotaur. You really only need to expend half of your magazine to put them down, even through their overshield. Versus red bars like the goblins or harpies in the encounter, crit damage jumps up to 10,062, with 6,708 being scored on body shots. And you're seeing that big increase there because exotic primaries do inherently deal 40% more damage to red bar targets. And this brings up two other points about Malfeasance. Since those slug detonations are blast damage, you can deal collateral damage, or get collateral kills for that matter. Now the blast radius is super tight on these, but maximum damage in this case is dealing 9,810. Also, if an enemy struck by Malfeasance rounds dies by any means, any slugs that hit that target will detonate on kill, which is a nice bonus feature not highlighted anywhere in the weapon's description. And on top of the overall damage being quite strong for a primary weapon, Malfeasance is also quite forgiving and easy to use. Since those detonations are going to occur on every 5 slugs landed, just drowning an enemy in body shots isn't really going to tank your damage. Neither is using this weapon outside of its maximum optimal range, which is about 28 meters. The rounds fired will see damage fall off, but the detonations themselves obviously will not. And this is an extremely stable weapon. This is what you get when you dump the magazine, making zero attempt to control the weapon's recoil. There's no noticeable pull or climb, a lot of these bullets are landing right on top of each other. Just a very, very easy weapon to stay on target with. And the icing on the cake is the intrinsic unstoppable capability, which does give Malfeasance a leg to stand on in higher end content, especially if you're like me and do enjoy running a Void subclass, since Unstoppables are the champion type that Void cannot deal with through class abilities. With Malfeasance, at any given time, you're always 5 shots away from a stun. So like I said earlier, this weapon is a really nice blend of damage output, utility, and usability. But regarding PvE, there are a few drawbacks. The reload speed isn't exactly fast, clocking in at a base 2.5 seconds. Now we do have that big 20 round magazine, so reloads aren't going to be extremely frequent, but especially in higher end activities, you don't really want to get caught out in the open with an empty mag. Then the ad clearing, well, it's good if the enemies are tightly grouped. If they are a bit more spread out, you're going to have to put bullets on each target that you're trying to put down. Whereas weapons like Outbreak or Sunshot, or legendaries that have the Volt Shot or Incandescent perk, can wipe out multiple enemies at a time in a much larger radius. Lastly, I can see the rise of Leviathan's Breath as a truly viable option, holding Malfeasance down a bit. It's kind of an apples to oranges comparison, with one being a fast-firing hand cannon and the other being a heavy bow, but with them both being exotics, it is a one or the other situation. And they both do intrinsically cover the unstoppable stunning role, with Leviathans knocking out unstoppable champions extremely efficiently. Plus in a boss DPS scenario, you can lean on it to put out some pretty darn good numbers. So I can definitely see a lot of players just saying, I'll go with Leviathans. Outside of just PvE though, there are a couple other interesting features that come along with Malfeasance. Being a weapon basically built for Gambit, it does tend to perform pretty well in there still. You're guaranteed to see taken enemies, so you can take advantage of that 25% taken predator buff. And versus an invading player, you can down them in as little as 3 crits or 5 body shots, and that's through the invader's overshield. Then in PvP, it definitely has some redeeming qualities, which I'll touch on, but I wanted to highlight the fact that it did lose some ground. I think it was about 9 months ago maybe, 180 hand cannons saw a buff in PvP. The optimal time to kill remained at 1 second, but instead of needing 3 crits in one body, they could now go 2 and 2. The body shot time to kill was improved though. Instead of needing 6 body shots, they could kill with 5. This used to be a value point for Malfeasance because it could always kill in 5 shots because of the explosive slugs. So it no longer has that advantage over other 180s. Although because of the explosive slugs, it is still lethal with 5 shots at any range. Another thing that it brings to the table is you can get a collateral kill. It's not an extremely likely scenario, but the explosive slug damage does max out at 45. That's 225 points of potential damage on 5 slugs. So if 2 players are standing shoulder to shoulder when those slugs go off, the potential is there to down a secondary target. Probably the biggest upside to bringing Malfeasance into the Crucible though is its ability to deal with roaming supers. And you actually need very little precision to do so. 5 body shots landed will drop a roaming super. Now, something like a Well of Radiance is going to give you a bit more trouble. I'm figuring you're going to need 10 rapidly landed precision shots to drop a Guardian in a well. Most players aren't just going to sit there and let you tee off on their face for 2.5 seconds, but I mean, in theory, it can be done. And I think that should about do it for what has become my yearly Malfeasance checkup. The weapon had been performing pretty well in PvE up to this point, and now it's doing just a little bit better thanks to that global hand cannon damage boost. If you haven't dusted it off recently, it is a good time to take it for a spin. And I will be looking at a few more hand cannons coming up, so if you're not already, feel free to subscribe to the channel if you don't want to miss those videos. If you did enjoy this one, please remember to leave it a like, and thank you for taking the time out of your day to check out this Malfeasance weapon breakdown. You guys are awesome, and I will catch you on the next one.